The clock on Dad's desk showed 8:30 when he called me into his study. I remember thinking it was weird because he usually watched the news around that time, but his voice had this strange calm to it that made my skin crawl. Something was off. "Sarah, come sit down," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. The room smelled like old books and his aftershave, but there was something else too. Someone else. That's when I noticed the man standing by the window. He was probably in his early 30s, wearing a navy suit that looked more expensive than anything in my closet. His hair was perfectly combed, and when he turned to look at me, his smile felt rehearsed. Everything about him screamed money and arrogance. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Richard," Dad said, his chest puffing out with pride. "Richard Morrison from the Morrison family. You know, they own Morrison Construction." I nodded politely, still confused about why this stranger was in our living room on a Tuesday night. Richard stepped forward and shook my hand. His grip was firm, possessive even, and his cologne was so strong it made my eyes water. Dad cleared his throat and clasped his hands behind his back. "Richard has asked for your hand in marriage, and I've given him my blessing." The words hit me like a slap. I blinked, sure I'd misheard. "What?" "It's a wonderful opportunity, sweetheart," Dad continued, his voice getting that tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "The Morrisons are one of the most respected families in town. Richard has a bright future ahead of him, and you'd want for nothing." I looked between the two men, feeling like I was in some twisted movie. "You're joking, right?" Dad's smile faltered. "This is serious, Sarah. Richard is willing to take care of you. You'll have a beautiful home, security, status, everything a woman could want." "I'm 17, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't even finished high school." Richard finally spoke, his voice smooth and condescending. "That's not a problem. Education isn't really necessary once we're married. I'll provide everything you need." The room started spinning. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped between these two men who had apparently decided my entire future without even asking what I wanted. "I need to think about this." Dad's face hardened. "There's nothing to think about. This is what's best for you, and frankly, you should be grateful. Not many girls get an opportunity like this." I said no. The words came out stronger than I felt. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face went from confused to angry in seconds. Before I knew what was happening, his hand came across my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? You're nothing without this family, without me. You'll never amount to anything on your own." My cheek burned, but his words hurt worse than the slap. Richard just stood there watching, not even flinching at what had just happened. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man Dad wanted me to marry. I ran upstairs to my room and locked the door, pressing my back against it as if that could keep out everything that had just happened. My reflection in the mirror showed a red handprint on my cheek and tears streaming down my face. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the ceiling until everyone went to sleep. Then I quietly packed a backpack with clothes, grabbed the emergency money Mom used to keep in the cookie jar, and wrote a short note explaining that I couldn't do this. I slipped out the back door at 3 a.m, walking toward the bus station with no real plan except to get as far away as possible. The last time I looked back at our house, all the lights were off. It looked peaceful, normal even. No one would have guessed that inside those walls, someone had just decided I was worth more as property than as a person. Boston was nothing like the small town I'd grown up in. The bus dropped me off at South Station at 6 a.m, and I stood there with my backpack feeling completely lost. People rushed past me like I was invisible, everyone moving with purpose while I had no idea what came next. I found a cheap hostel in Chinatown that charged $15 a night. The room smelled like disinfectant and had stains on the carpet I didn't want to think about, but it was a roof over my head. My emergency fund would last maybe 2 weeks if I was careful. Those first few days were rough. I'd never been alone like this before. Every morning I'd wake up in that tiny bunk bed surrounded by strangers and wonder what the hell I was doing. I missed my mom's cooking, my own bed, even my annoying little brother Tommy. But I didn't miss the fear of walking on eggshells around Dad. Finding work was harder than I'd expected. Most places wanted experience I didn't have, or asked questions about why a 17-year-old was living alone. I lied about my age, said I was 19, and eventually found a job at Murphy's Diner on the South Side. The owner, Frank, was this gruff Irish guy who took one look at me and probably knew I was desperate. "You ever waitressed before?" he asked, wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. "Sure," I lied. He laughed. "Right. Well, you'll learn fast or you'll be gone fast. Tips are yours, but you mess up orders and it comes out of your pay." Murphy's wasn't fancy. The vinyl booths were cracked, the coffee was terrible, and the regulars were mostly construction workers and night shift nurses who wanted their eggs over easy and didn't have patience for mistakes. I burned myself on the grill, dropped plates, and messed up orders more times than I could count in my first week. But I learned. I watched the other waitresses, memorized which customers liked what, figured out how to balance 4 plates on one arm. Mrs. Chen, who worked the morning shift, taught me how to make the register work and which customers to watch out for. "That one," she'd whisper, pointing to a guy in a baseball cap, "always tries to skip out on the check." The money was terrible. After paying for the hostel and buying the cheapest food I could find, I barely had anything left. I started staying at the library until it closed, partly to save on heating costs, but mostly because I loved being surrounded by books again. I'd forgotten how much I missed reading. Late at night, lying in that uncomfortable bunk, I'd sometimes wonder if I'd made a huge mistake. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe I really wouldn't amount to anything. The girl in the next bed had been there for 3 months and seemed to have given up on finding anything better. But then, I'd remember Richard's smug face and Dad's hand across my cheek, and I knew I'd rather struggle here than live comfortably as someone's property. After a month at Murphy's, Frank offered me more shifts. "You're not terrible anymore," he said, which was basically a compliment coming from him. The extra money meant I could afford a shared apartment in Dorchester with 3 other girls. It wasn't much. My room was barely bigger than a closet, and the bathroom had a lock that didn't work. But it was mine. I started taking online classes using the library's computers. Basic business courses, marketing, anything that seemed useful. The other girls thought I was crazy, studying after working double shifts, but I had this feeling that knowledge was the only thing no one could take away from me. One night, after a particularly good tip day, I bought myself a small notebook and started writing down business ideas. Stupid ones mostly, but I kept writing anyway. I figured if I was going to make it on my own, I needed to think bigger than just getting by. By the time I turned 21, I'd been at Murphy's for 3 years and had saved up almost $4,000. Not much by most people's standards, but it felt like a fortune to me. I'd also finished my GED and completed several online business courses. Frank had even made me assistant manager, which mostly meant I got to deal with angry customers and count the register at closing. The idea for my business came from pure frustration. I loved jewelry but couldn't afford anything decent on my salary. The cheap stuff from discount stores turned my skin green, and the nice pieces were way out of my budget. So I started making my own. I bought supplies from a craft store in Cambridge and taught myself wire wrapping and basic metalworking through YouTube videos. My first attempts were awful. Crooked, uneven, definitely not something anyone would pay for. But I kept practicing during my breaks at work, and slowly the pieces started looking less like a child's art project. My roommate Kelly was the first person to buy something from me. She saw a pair of silver earrings I'd made and offered me $20 for them. I almost said no, because they were for me, but $20 was $20. "You should sell these online," she said, holding them up to the light. "They're really good." I started an Etsy shop called Sarah's Workshop, with terrible photos taken on my phone and descriptions that probably had spelling mistakes. The first month, I sold exactly nothing. The second month, 1 bracelet to someone in Oregon. But that one sale was enough to keep me going. I reinvested every penny I made back into materials and better tools. I'd work my shifts at Murphy's, come home exhausted, and then spend hours in my tiny room making earrings and necklaces by the light of a desk lamp. My fingers were constantly cut up from the wire, and I probably inhaled too much metal dust. But I was creating something that was entirely mine. The breakthrough came almost by accident. A food blogger I followed on Instagram posted a picture wearing one of my necklaces. She'd bought it without knowing who I was. Her post got thousands of likes, and suddenly my inbox was flooded with orders. I was completely unprepared. I had maybe 10 pieces ready to ship, and suddenly needed 50. I called in sick to Murphy's for 3 days straight, and worked around the clock to fill orders. Kelly and my other roommates helped me package everything, and we basically turned our apartment into a shipping center. Frank wasn't happy about me missing work, but when I showed him my sales numbers, he just shook his head and smiled. Good for you, kid. Just don't forget us little people when you're rich and famous. Within 6 months, I was making more from jewelry than from the diner. I finally quit Murphy's on a busy Saturday morning, during the breakfast rush that I'd dreaded for years. Walking out of there for the last time felt like shedding an old skin. I moved into my own studio apartment in Cambridge. Nothing fancy, but it had good light and enough space for a proper workspace. I bought real tools, professional supplies, and started experimenting with more complex designs. My Instagram following grew to over 10,000 people, and fashion bloggers started reaching out for collaborations. The hardest part was learning the business side. Taxes, inventory management, customer service, all the boring stuff they don't show you in movies about entrepreneurs. I made plenty of mistakes, like the time I accidentally promised 2-day shipping during Christmas and had to drive packages to the post office at midnight for a week straight. But I was learning, growing, becoming someone I never thought I could be. When I looked in the mirror now, I saw a business owner, an artist, a woman who'd built something from nothing. The scared 17-year-old who'd run away in the middle of the night felt like a different person entirely. Still, late at night, when I was working alone in my studio, I'd sometimes hear Dad's voice telling me I'd never amount to anything. Those words had a way of creeping in during quiet moments, making me doubt myself just when things were going well. I never planned on going back to Millfield. Hell, I'd spent 5 years pretending that place didn't exist. But sometimes life has other plans for you. The invitation came through my business email. Someone had found me through my website. The Millfield Chamber of Commerce was hosting their first ever Young Entrepreneurs Summit and wanted me as a keynote speaker. The irony wasn't lost on me. The girl who'd run away with nothing but a backpack was being invited back to talk about success. I stared at that email for 3 days before responding. My business was doing well. Really well. I'd just signed a deal with a boutique chain in California and had featured in 2 major fashion magazines. My jewelry was selling faster than I could make it, and I'd hired 2 part-time assistants to help with production and shipping. But going back to Millfield meant facing everything I'd left behind. It meant driving past the house where Dad had slapped me and called me worthless. It meant potentially running into people who knew about the arranged marriage, who might have whispered about why I'd disappeared. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, thought it could be good for me. Sometimes we need to face our past to fully move forward. She said, during our session that week, "You've built an incredible life for yourself, Sarah. Maybe it's time to let that 17-year-old girl see what she accomplished." So I said yes. The drive from Boston to Millfield took 3 hours in my Honda Civic. Nothing fancy, but it was mine and it was paid off. As I got closer to town, everything started looking familiar in that uncomfortable way. The same gas station where I used to buy candy with my allowance. The high school where I should have graduated but didn't. Main Street with its row of old brick buildings that never seemed to change. I'd booked a room at the Hampton Inn on the outskirts of town. No way was I staying anywhere I might run into people I knew before I was ready. The event wasn't until the next evening, which gave me a whole day to walk around and reacquaint myself with the place I'd once called home. Everything felt smaller than I remembered. The downtown area that had seemed so important when I was a kid was just a few blocks of tired-looking shops and restaurants. The library where I'd spent hours reading looked exactly the same, down to the faded paint on the front steps. I drove past my old house without stopping. It looked different. Dad had repainted it blue instead of white, and there was a new fence around the yard. I wondered if he still lived there, if Mom was still putting up with his temper and his need to control everything. The Entrepreneurship Summit was being held at the Community Center, a building I remembered from school concerts and town meetings. When I walked in for the sound check that afternoon, wearing my best blazer and feeling more confident than I had in years, I was surprised by how many people were there. Maybe 50 or 60, mostly young people, but some older business owners too. The event coordinator, a woman named Janet who couldn't have been much older than me, was practically bouncing with excitement. "Sarah, oh my God, I can't believe you're actually here. I've been following your story online. It's so inspiring. That's when it hit me that people here knew about my business. They'd been watching what I'd built, following my success from a distance. It felt strange to think that while I'd been trying to forget this place, some people here had been rooting for me. The talk went better than I'd expected. I told them about starting with nothing, about the early days of working at Murphy's Diner and making jewelry in my tiny room. I talked about the importance of taking risks and believing in yourself even when nobody else does. I didn't mention Dad or the arranged marriage. That wasn't their story to hear. During the Q&A, a young girl who couldn't have been more than 16 raised her hand. What would you say to someone whose family doesn't support their dreams? I looked at her and saw myself at that age, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd say that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who understand us the least, I finally answered. But that doesn't mean your dreams aren't valid. Sometimes you have to be your own family. After the event, people came up to congratulate me and ask for business cards. A few mentioned that they'd heard about my father, about how proud he must be now. I just smiled and changed the subject. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I was getting coffee at Rosie's cafe the next morning when I saw him. Dad was sitting alone at a corner table, stirring his coffee with the same methodical movements I remembered from childhood. He looked older, grayer, smaller somehow. The man who had loomed so large in my memories seemed diminished, ordinary. For a moment, I considered leaving. I could walk out, drive back to Boston, and pretend this moment never happened. But something kept me frozen in place, watching him through the window. He looked up and saw me. Our eyes met for the first time in 5 years, and I watched his face go through a series of emotions. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been regret. He half stood from his chair, then sat back down, clearly unsure what to do. I bought my coffee and walked over to his table. My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady. "Hi, Dad. Sarah." He said my name like he wasn't sure he had the right to say it. I was at your talk last night. That surprised me. I hadn't seen him in the audience, but then again, I'd been focused on not falling apart on stage. "What did you think?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. When he finally looked up, his eyes were watery. I think I made the biggest mistake of my life. I sat down across from him, not sure what I was expecting to feel. Anger, maybe. Satisfaction. Instead, I just felt tired. Which mistake was that? All of it. His voice cracked. The marriage thing with Richard, hitting you, the things I said, letting you walk out that door. He took a shaky breath. "I've been following your business online. Janet from the Chamber of Commerce. She's my neighbor's daughter. She's been showing me articles about you for years." It was strange to think of him Googling my name, reading about my success from a distance. "Why didn't you ever reach out?" What was I supposed to say? He laughed bitterly. "Sorry I tried to sell you like cattle. Sorry I called you worthless when you're clearly worth more than I ever was." I'd imagined this conversation so many times over the years. In some versions, I yelled at him. In others, I walked away without saying a word. But sitting here now, looking at this broken man who used to terrify me, I mostly felt sad. "Where's Mom?" I asked. "She left 2 years ago. Moved to Florida to be near her sister." He rubbed his forehead. "She tried to get me to find you, to apologize. Said I was a stubborn fool. She was right." We sat in silence for a while. The cafe around us was filling up with the morning crowd. People getting coffee before work. Retired folks meeting for breakfast. Normal people living normal lives. None of them carrying the weight of 5 years of silence and regret. "I was so angry when you left," he said finally. Not just angry, humiliated. Richard's family thought I couldn't control my own daughter. People in town started whispering. "I blamed you for embarrassing me. I was 17, Dad. I was your child, and you hit me. I know." He looked directly at me for the first time since I'd sat down. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry, Sarah. I was trying to protect you, to give you a good life, but I was really just trying to make myself look important. I traded my daughter for status, and I lost everything that mattered. The apology I'd waited years to hear didn't feel the way I'd expected. It didn't erase the pain, or make the last 5 years disappear. It just was what it was. Words from a man who'd realized too late what he'd done. "You didn't lose me because I left," I said quietly. "You lost me the moment you decided my life belonged to you instead of me." He nodded, tears running down his cheeks now. "I see that now. Took me way too long, but I see it. You were braver at 17 than I've ever been. You knew your own worth when I couldn't see it." I finished my coffee and stood up. "I forgive you, Dad. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to let this go." He looked up at me with hope in his eyes. "Does that mean—" "It means I forgive you," I repeated. "It doesn't mean we're going to be a family again. Too much has happened for that. But I don't want to hate you anymore." It's exhausting. I left him sitting there and walked out into the morning sunshine. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a heavy bag for years and had finally set it down. The drive back to Boston felt different than the drive down. I had the windows open, music playing, and for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of wondering what would happen if I ever saw my father again. I knew now. We'd talked. We'd both said things that needed to be said, and the world hadn't ended. Back in my apartment, I looked around at everything I'd built. The workbench where I created my designs, the computer where I managed orders from customers all over the country, the wall covered with photos from magazine features and happy customers wearing my jewelry. This was my life. Messy, imperfect, but entirely mine. I started writing that night. Not business plans or marketing copy, but the real story of how I'd gotten here. I wrote about the arranged marriage, about sleeping in hostels and burning myself on the grill at Murphy's. I wrote about the fear and the loneliness and the small victories that had eventually added up to something bigger. A few months later, I published a blog post called "Running Away to Find Myself" on my business website. I wasn't sure anyone would care about my story, but within a week, it had been shared thousands of times. Young women wrote to me from all over the world, telling me about their own struggles with controlling families, abusive relationships, dreams that seemed impossible. One email stuck with me. It was from a girl named Maria in Texas whose parents wanted her to drop out of college to take care of her younger siblings. "I keep your story saved on my phone," she wrote. "When I want to give up, I read it and remember that brave girls can become strong women." That's when I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every girl who'd ever been told she wasn't worth much. Every young woman who'd ever had to choose between safety and freedom. I started speaking at more events, not just about business, but about courage and self-worth. The jewelry business kept growing. I hired more employees, moved into a real studio space in Cambridge, and started selling to boutiques across the country. But the success felt different now. Not like something I was desperate to prove, but like something I genuinely enjoyed creating. I even started dating again. Nothing serious, but I met people who saw me as I was now, not as the scared girl I used to be. It was strange at first, trusting someone enough to let them get close, but I was learning that not everyone wanted to control or diminish me. Sometimes people asked if I ever regretted leaving home so young, if I wished things had been different with my family. The honest answer was complicated. I regretted that my father couldn't see my worth without me having to prove it by leaving. I regretted that my mother had stayed quiet when she should have spoken up. I regretted that I'd missed my brother's high school graduation and didn't know what kind of man he'd become. But I didn't regret leaving. Every scar, every lonely night, every moment of doubt had led me to exactly where I was supposed to be. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to build something meaningful with my hands and my heart, to stand up for what I believed in even when it cost me everything. The girl who'd packed a backpack and snuck out in the middle of the night couldn't have imagined the woman she'd become. She'd been running away from something, but she'd accidentally been running toward something too. Toward herself, toward a life where she got to decide what she was worth. Late at night, when I was working on a new design or answering emails from customers, I'd sometimes think about that moment in Dad's study when Richard had looked at me like I was property to be acquired. I wondered what would have happened if I'd said yes, if I'd been the obedient daughter and married the man they'd chosen for me. But those thoughts never lasted long. I knew exactly what would have happened. I would have disappeared, become someone else's version of who I should be. Instead, I'd become myself, fully and completely, scars and all. And that was worth everything I'd given up to get here.